Hey students, this is Gwen, your instructor. This lecture is doomed to never get recorded because it'll be the 5th time I've recorded it without making a mistake. So I'm hoping I can make it through this one. It's only going to last about 15 to 20 minutes, but I wanted to show you, especially the online students, this is what our book looks like, EMO 12, Washington Pesticide Laws and Safety. And what I want to go through today is just chapter 1, and I want to let people know that we are going to have a little quiz, the review questions on the chapter. Tomorrow we'll just go through those. I'm announcing it so you can look through it and look at it'll only take you probably 10 or 15 minutes to go through it at that. But so giving an introduction to pests and pest management, our earliest known big problem with pests was back in the 14th century before I was born, when we had the Black Plague of Europe. And they thought it was some mysterious scourge and punishment for things that they had done for their previous behaviors. But basically they found out later that that it was actually a bacterial disease spread to humans by rats. And actually the fleas fed on the rats that were diseased, and then the fleas fed on the humans when the rats left and they got infected. So if the disease was properly diagnosed, they didn't die, but they didn't know what it was back then. And then the other major thing that took place back in the 19th century was just the fact that we had the potato famine in Ireland, and that was caused by late blight. And what happened was these infected potatoes would stay in storage, and over storage they would rot, and then there wasn't anything left for them to eat. So as a result, as you can see on the text here, we see that thousands of Irish did starve, but they moved to the United States. And that's why we have such a large Irish population in the United States now. So it was actually pretty good for the United States. But now we've managed this disease through resistant cultivars, some proper sanitation, and the use of pesticides at the right time. So here we'll do the definition of pest, which is a plant or animal detrimental to man, one that pesters or annoys. So if it's not a pest to you, then you don't need to control it, but to somebody else it could be. And there were over the times, a lot of mysteries about why things happened, that it was a mystical thing. But you can see that the earliest use of chemicals actually dates back to 2500 BC when they burned sulfur to control insects and mites in crops. And then there were additional pesticides that came along. And some of those were, you can see plant-derived insecticides such as hellebore, was used to control body lice, nicotine to control aphids, and pyrethrins to control a wide variety of insects. But there was some lethalness to nicotine and the pyrethrins as well. Lead arsenate was used in 1892 as an orchard spray, and we've had difficulties with the buildup of the arsenicals in the soil. And then in the late 19th century in France, they came up with a mixture of lime and copper sulfate. And they sprayed the grapevines just to keep people from eating the grapes as they went along the road so they'd have some left for wine. And in the meantime, they found out that it controlled downy mildew, which is a serious fungus disease of grapes. So now this was named the Bordeaux mixture, and we still keep it as one of our most widely used fungicides in the world, which was found by mistake. Our first pesticides really were developed in the 1940s. During World War II, and DDT was actually derived to protect the troops from insect-transmitted diseases. It was a chlorinated hydrocarbon, so those chlorines on the atoms helped it survive long in the field, so they didn't have to make multiple applications. Then after this product, they came out with some synthetic organic pesticides like 2,4-D, aldrin, heptachlor, that might not have lasted quite as long. But this is how we started into the modern day pesticide. Okay, they did provide season-long crop protection, so they didn't have to apply them very long, but with some of these products, some of the concerns that they came into was the length of the residual in the environment. And then the other thing was that we started to see our first resistance to pesticides back in 1908 when the San Jose scale became resistant to lime sulfur. And since then, over 500 species of insects have become resistant to one or more insecticides, and more than 180 weed species and hundreds of plant pathogens, which are the disease-causing organisms, they're resistant to pesticides as well. And a good example of a modern day one is the Colorado potato beetle in the eastern United States. It has developed resistance to every major group of insecticides, which is why we rotate products. Okay, so the concern was about the residual in the environment. And one of the first people to notice that or to bring it up was Rachel Carson. She wrote a book called Silent Spring in 1962, which if you've never read it, you should read it. It's got some misconceptions in it, but it did bring forward some very important points about these longer residual products that we didn't know what was happening. And it was a major, the length that they survived was a major factor in them being used because they didn't have to apply them as much, but then it seemed to accumulate in the fatty tissues of some animals, which was causing them to not be able to reproduce. And so let's just talk about some of the concerns that were brought up. Here is this biomagnification, or what happens with pesticides within a community. And you can see that we've got a very small amount, a trillionth of a part per billion, or a part per trillion here. So we got 3 parts per trillion. And then by the time we get through the plankton, the zooplankton, the fish, and then the birds actually eat the fish, they're up to 20 parts per million that they're getting. So that's a pretty significant increase from a 3 parts per trillion to 20 parts per million. It's a magnification factor of 6. So that got to be a serious thing where it actually got into the eggshells and they couldn't hatch eggs, and led them to be on the Endangered Species Act, or the development of the Endangered Species Act, and we actually banned DDT. But before that happened, because of this book, the Environmental Protection Agency was created in 1970, and in 1972 the EPA banned DDT in the United States, and they actually have looked over many chemicals, and some of the longer lasting ones are the ones that have since gone off the market. Okay, so they began looking at other commonly used insecticides. They came up with another group of insecticide compounds known as organophosphates. They have some nerve toxins in them, and they're more expensive than the chlorinated hydrocarbons, but they were far less persistent in the environment. So it really required that you used them appropriately and used your personal protective equipment well. And these chemicals were also more selective in their spectrum of control, more compatible with the environment, but that means you have to know more about your insects and the timing when you get more selective. So integrated pest management means that we're going to use all the tools we have at our disposal to plan our strategic plan. So that means I'm going to use cultural, chemical, all different types of control. But each one of our IPM systems, depending on where you are, what decisions you make, what crop you're doing, is going to change. So the 5 steps to developing a pest management program would be to identify the pest so that we know its life cycle, when we should hit it, all the different things that go with that. We need to define the management system, so that means how big is the area I'm using? Do I have a small yard, a barn, 1,000-acre field? What kind of a system is it? Develop the plant pest management strategy. So I'm going to coordinate the use of multiple tactics into one system. And my goal is going to be to maintain pest numbers and damage at an economically or aesthetically acceptable level. Develop reliable monitoring techniques. And if we look in the text, these monitoring techniques consist of scouting, insect traps, rainfall, weather, temperature. So all these things that I can do to look at how I can change the level of the pest. And then I'm going to use economic thresholds, which an economic threshold here is the level or density of a pest population where control measures need to be applied to keep the pest from reaching economic injury level. And the definition of economic injury level is the pest population density that causes losses equal to the cost of control measures. So ideally, my control measures should cost less than the damage caused by the pest, or I shouldn't make an application. Okay, so my IPM strategies behind each thing is that I've got Mechanical control, physical control, cultural control, genetic control, and biological control. Shouldn't move so fast. Okay, so mechanical control, anything that can reduce the spread of the populations. So mechanical controls include hand destruction, traps, mechanical exclusion such as screens, nets. We see them used predominantly on fruiting crops, grapes, cherries, fences for larger areas to keep deer and elk out. We can also use physical control, which means manipulation of water, humidity, temperature, electric shock, light, or other radiant energy. So these approaches are used to control insects and diseases, but they can be used to control other pests. So basically anything physical control will kill the pest, disrupt their life cycle, or make the environment unfavorable for their existence. Cultural control is manipulation of the environment to avert serious pest damage. So this might be selecting the right plant for the site, managing irrigation, rotating crops if you can do that, pruning the affected areas and disposing of it so it doesn't infect the rest of the crop. Genetic controls can be used by simple traditional breeding techniques, and we might use some gene manipulation, which we call the genetically modified plants. It could be turning on a gene, turning off a gene. Most of our traditional breeding has still been in use, but there are some genetically modified plants being used as well. But that's to help us try to have resistance to diseases and insects. Okay, so that's talked about by a lot of people. Biological controls would involve the introduction, encouragement, and increase of plants and animals that are parasites or predators of a pest species. They're mostly used to control insects and weeds. Usually if a plant is native to an area, it'll have a predator that will help keep the population in balance. Some of the times where we've brought in plants and things like that where they don't have a balancing would be reed canary grass, which is taken over all of our ditches when we brought it in to stabilize ditch banks. We brought in kudzu in the south to help stabilize banks, and it got away, and you can watch that grow by the inch because there was no biological control. So we need to look at these things and look at the whole picture. When we get into trouble, it's when we only consider one or two aspects of it. With chemical controls, you can see all of my pesticide is the general term, and you can see on this particular page right here that we have all these bactericides, fungicides. They're named after what they're going to control. Insecticides control insects, nematicides control nematodes, pesticides control fish, rodenticides control rodents, and then we also have defoliants, which cause the leaves to drop from a plant, desiccants, which dry the plants out, and growth regulators, which will limit the growth of a plant. So even though those don't kill insects, weeds, or diseases, they adjust the plant. So they are also treated as pesticides, and pesticides is the general term. Washington also includes adjuvants in their pesticide area, and adjuvants are substances added to pesticide formulations or tank mixtures to increase safety or effectiveness. Okay, so that'll be very different. And then I want you to know the difference between a systemic pesticide, which means that it can be foliar or root absorbed and translocated within the plant, and contact pesticides, which aren't absorbed or translocated by the plants or animals, so the pest has to come in contact with a treated area to be controlled. Okay, and we do classify some of the pesticides according to their route of entry into a pest. So you could have some stomach poisons that have to be ingested by them. And some contact toxins only need to touch the pest. The important thing on the bottom of this page 5 here at the end of the chapter is FIFRA. You're going to need to know what that is, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. And it's administered by the EPA, and state pesticide law is contained in the Washington Pesticide Application Act and the Washington Pesticide Control Act, and the rules adopted under them are administered by the Washington State Department of Agriculture. And for those of you in other states, like those of you in Texas, the Texas Department of Agriculture probably monitors them, and Oregon Department of Agriculture, Idaho Department of Agriculture. And then the legal controls to limit the development of pest populations by restricting human activities. APHIS was developed, which is the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service at the federal level, and the WSDA, Washington State Department of Agriculture, at the state level. And this required that your plants and soils and everything had to be inspected as they came into the country so that we didn't spread insects and disease populations throughout the United States. So this ends the first introductory chapter, and we will do the review questions on Chapter 1 tomorrow. So please look over them. And those of you online, I will PDF it and post it for you, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.